The first time Claire left a note, she wasn't expecting anything. The man in room 413 had been comatose for 6 weeks by then, tethered to life by a quiet army of machines. His name, according to the chart, was Elias Whittaker, 38 years old, no listed emergency contacts, a construction foreman, judging by the worn leather boots tucked beneath his bedside table and the faint scent of earth and pine that still clung to his flannel jacket folded neatly in the closet. Claire didn't know what compelled her that day. Maybe it was the way the sunlight angled through the blinds and caught the gold flecks in his stubble, making him look almost warm. Or maybe it was the way her own heart had been quietly aching for something, anything, to feel close to. She pulled a slip of hospital stationery from the desk drawer at the nurse's station and wrote, "Good morning, Elias. It's quiet on the floor today. I adjusted your pillow. You looked like you were dreaming. I hope it was something nice." She folded it once and slid it between the pages of the paperback resting on his bedside tray, a tattered copy of Lonesome Dove that had been found in his truck. It was a small thing, a whisper really. But as she stood there, watching his chest rise and fall beneath the pale green blanket, she felt something loosen in her ribcage. Claire had been a nurse for 11 years, long enough to see how easily a person could vanish, not just die but disappear while still breathing. Most of the other patients had family, visitors, flowers that came and went with the rhythms of hope and loss, but Elias had no one, no calls, no letters, no voice beside his bed reading the paper aloud or telling old stories. Just Claire and the other nurses, who rotated shifts and did their best to preserve his dignity in a world that had forgotten him. But now there was a note, and the next morning another. "You had a little wrinkle between your brows today. What were you frowning at? Someone brought muffins to the break room. Blueberry, you missed out, but I saved you one just in case." She wrote to him like she was writing to herself, like the space between them could be bridged by ink and tenderness. There was no grand plan, no intention of continuing it for weeks. It just became something she did, like checking his vitals or smoothing the sheets around his feet. Sometimes she slipped a note under his palm and let her fingers rest there for a moment longer than necessary. His hand was warm, alive, and something in her chest flickered like a porch light left on through the night. Claire wasn't new to grief. 3 years earlier, her husband Micah had died on a rainy road 5 miles from their home, the taillights of his car folding into the dark like a dream undone. She had stayed upright through the funeral, through the casseroles and condolences, through the months of silence that followed. She went back to work, kept her head down. Her grief didn't rage, it simply settled into her bones, steady and unseen. But Elias was different. He made her want to speak again, even if he couldn't answer. By the third week, her notes had grown longer. She told him about the other patients, Mrs. Patel in 409 who swore she once danced with Elvis, or Mr. Dalton who kept trying to bribe the orderlies with butterscotch. She told him about her garden at home, how the basil had finally come in strong, how the tomatoes were stubborn this year. And sometimes, when she was tired enough to forget her caution, she told him things she hadn't said aloud in years. "I miss him most in the mornings. That's when the house is too quiet. I didn't know I could still feel this much. I thought I was emptied out." She never expected him to wake. That was the quiet truth she held behind her careful hope. But one Tuesday morning, when the light slanted warm across the bed and the scent of late summer lilies wafted in from the nurse's station bouquet, Claire stepped into room 413 and froze. His eyes were open. They weren't wild or confused, just steady, watching her like he knew her already. The notes she'd left one yesterday, a short one, something about the smell of rain on asphalt. She had tucked it into the book again, just like always. His voice was barely audible, cracked from disuse and thin as tissue, but it carried. "You're Claire," he said. She felt the air leave her body in a hush. "You're the reason I came back." The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls had drawn close to listen. Claire's breath caught, her clipboard tilting in her hands as she stared at him, half certain this was a dream stitched from too many night shifts and too much quiet hope. Elias blinked slowly, his gaze heavy with the weight of waking. "I remembered the notes," he whispered, voice raw and cracked at the edges. "Not the words, not exactly, but how they made me feel, like someone was waiting." Claire stepped closer before she could stop herself, every nerve humming. She'd imagined this moment in 1,000 quiet ways, had tried not to, but none of her quiet imaginings felt like this. There was nothing cinematic about it, no dramatic music, just the beep of the heart monitor, the faint shuffle of footsteps in the hallway, and the feeling of something deeply personal unfolding in plain daylight. "I didn't know you could hear them," she said softly. Not at first, his lips barely moved, but eventually, it was like a light through fog. "I started hoping you'd come back every day." She reached for a cup of water, pressing it to his lips, steadying his hand with hers. His fingers trembled with effort. Every muscle seemed to be relearning what it meant to belong to a body, but his eyes stayed on hers, unwavering. There wasn't time for awe, not in the practical sense. Claire paged the attending physician, documented his signs of consciousness, checked his pupil responses, noted every blink and breath with practiced precision. But beneath her nurse's calm, something was unraveling inside her, or maybe knitting itself back together. The staff reacted with a kind of hushed elation. Waking after a coma this long wasn't common, and when it happened, it carried the fragile weight of miracle. Doctors murmured over his charts. Therapists were scheduled. Word filtered quietly through the floor, and by the end of the day, nurses from other units were stopping by room 413 on their lunch breaks just to witness it. But only Claire knew about the notes. She didn't mention them to anyone, not even when Elias asked for them later, his voice stronger, eyes brighter. "They're still in the book," she said, pulling Lonesome Dove from the tray and setting it in his hands. "You probably don't remember much yet, that's okay, you can read them now if you'd like." His fingers moved slowly, reverent as he opened the pages and unfolded the slips of paper. They rustled like wings. She watched him scan the words, brow furrowed, lips curving in the faintest shadow of a smile. "You told me about your Basil," he murmured, thumb brushing over a note she'd written on a particularly lonely Thursday, "and a patient who thought Elvis taught her to waltz. She was very convincing." He looked up, and for a moment the air between them felt intimate in a way that startled her. "You didn't have to do this, I was just some guy in a bed." Claire hesitated, then said the truth. You were you, and I didn't know what else to do but talk to you like you could hear me. It helped me too, if I'm honest." Ilias nodded slowly, and something quiet passed between them, an understanding that didn't need to be named. Recovery was never linear. The next few days were long and slow. He moved from silence to halting conversation, from small sips of broth to solid food. Physical therapy began with gentle movements, just his arms and neck at first. Every gain was hard-won, every frustration real, but Claire was there through it all. She found herself adjusting her schedule just to catch his waking hours. She didn't plan it, it just happened. Morning rounds stretched longer than necessary. Her lunch breaks often ended with her sitting beside his bed, reading to him from the book he never finished. He liked her voice, said it anchored him, that even when he didn't understand the story, it made him feel steady. One afternoon, as September stretched into gold and chill, he asked her a question that made her breath hitch. "Do you still talk to me when I'm asleep?" Claire looked up from the chart she'd been updating. "Sometimes, habit, I guess." His smile was faint but genuine. "I think I'd like that, keep doing it, even if I'm quiet." "You're always quiet," she teased. "I'm listening now, though." Later, when she went home, she found herself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, her body still echoing with the sound of his voice. It wasn't just the joy of seeing a patient recover. It was something else, something slower, deeper, a warmth she hadn't let herself feel in years. And yet it scared her too. There was a fragility to what they were building, delicate, not because it was false, but because it was real, and real things could break. Weeks passed. Elias moved from a hospital bed to a recovery room. His hair was growing and thicker now, his face no longer hollow. He could walk the hallway with help, his muscles remembering their old rhythm. But what struck Claire most was his attentiveness. He noticed when she looked tired, asked about her garden without prompting. Once, he told her that the sound of her laugh had been the first thing he remembered clearly after waking. He said it so casually, so openly, and Claire had to excuse herself for a moment in the supply closet, where she let herself feel the full weight of being seen. One day, near the end of her shift, she found another note, folded carefully and tucked into her coat pocket where it hung in the staff lounge. Her heart stuttered when she opened it. "You're the reason I came back, but I'd like to stay for you too, Elias." She read it twice, 3 times, then folded it carefully like it might tear and pressed it against her chest. For the first time in 3 years, Claire allowed herself to hope for something she couldn't name yet, something that had nothing to do with duty or healing or survival. Just the quiet, impossible possibility of love. The first time they saw each other outside the hospital, it was raining. Not the kind of rain that came down in sheets, but the slow, steady kind that softened edges and made the world smell like earth and memory. Elias had been discharged a week earlier. His recovery, while still ongoing, had passed the point where daily care was needed, and the hospital had faded into a chapter he was supposed to turn the page on. Claire wasn't sure what she had expected when he left. Maybe a clean goodbye, a thank you and a handshake, maybe that would have been easier. But he hadn't disappeared. He texted her 2 days after he left, something small, a photo of a garden shop display. Rows of herbs, a handwritten sign that said "Buy one basil, get one free, thought of you," the message read. She smiled at it for far longer than made sense. Now, standing beneath the narrow awning of a cafe downtown, they looked at each other like something familiar had stepped out of a dream. I wasn't sure if this would be weird, Elias said, brushing a raindrop from his brow with the sleeve of his jacket. His movements were steadier now, though he still carried the careful grace of someone rebuilding. It is weird, Claire said with a smile, but I'm glad you called. They found a corner table inside, next to a fogged-up window. She watched the rain bead and run down the glass as Elias ordered coffee for them both, black for him, vanilla cream for her. He remembered. She didn't know when she'd told him, but he had tucked it away like he did with so many small things. He was quieter outside the hospital, but not in a way that made the silence uncomfortable. It was thoughtful, almost shy. The way someone might be with a person they admire but don't want to scare off. Claire felt her own nerves fluttering too, but there was a strange comfort in the honesty of it. I don't know how to do this, Elias said finally, tracing the rim of his mug with a finger. I've been waking up every day and trying to figure out how to live again, but this, sitting here with you, it feels like the only part that makes sense. Claire looked down at her hands. They were steadier now too, not because she wasn't afraid, but because something inside her had shifted. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was starting to feel again, want again. I never planned for any of this, she said, her voice low, but when you woke up and said what you did, it was like someone reached into the dark and lit a match. I didn't realize how long I'd been sitting in the quiet. Elias leaned forward slightly. I remember the first time I felt the notes. I couldn't see them, I couldn't move, but there was this sense, like someone was holding the thread of me, keeping it from snapping. He hesitated. I think that's what love is, not the loud kind, not the stuff you read about, just someone refusing to let go. Claire's throat tightened. She reached for her coffee, if only to have something to hold. The cafe was quiet except for the rain and the low clink of cups behind the counter. Outside, people passed with umbrellas tilted and coats pulled tight, moving through the day unaware that two people inside had just laid down pieces of themselves for the other to see. They didn't define anything that day. No confessions, no plans, but something had begun, something fragile, yes, but rooted in something real, not fantasy, not need, just care, quiet, patient, and unwavering. Over the next month, Claire and Elias found themselves crossing into each other's lives in small, meaningful ways. He stopped by the hospital on good days, not often enough to be inappropriate, just enough to remind her that he was still there. Sometimes he brought her coffee. Once, a paperback he said reminded him of her, the snow child with its quiet magic and long silences. They went for walks, slow ones. He was still rebuilding his stamina. Once they found a trail just outside the city where the trees bent low and the leaves crunched underfoot, and he told her about his job before the accident, how he loved building things, not just structures, but the way homes settled into the land, the way wood held warmth. You were a nurse even then, Claire said, teasing gently. He glanced at her. How do you figure? You paid attention to what made people feel safe. Elias smiled, and the look he gave her was steady and full of something she wasn't ready to name, but felt all the same. Later that evening, he invited her to his apartment for the first time. It was small, sparsely furnished since he hadn't lived there much before the accident, but clean and quiet and filled with afternoon light. There were signs of him everywhere, his tools stacked neatly in a corner, a ceramic mug with a chipped rim by the sink, and on the bookshelf, tucked between old manuals and a cracked-spine novel, every note Claire had ever written to him. You kept them, she said, fingers brushing the edges of one. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then, they were the only thing that made me feel human. I used to think if I ever woke up I'd throw them away, pretend it hadn't happened, but I can't, they're a part of me now. She looked at him then and her heart ached with something tender and raw. The kind of ache that wasn't about pain, but about finally being seen, understood. That night they sat side by side on the couch, knees barely touching, as music played softly from the corner speaker. Claire told him stories about her husband, not all of them sad. She laughed as she remembered how Micah used to burn toast and pretend it was extra crispy. How he sang the wrong lyrics to every song but swore he was right. I loved him, she said finally, and I lost him, and for a long time I thought that was the whole story. Elias didn't rush to fill the silence, he just let it be. Then softly, what if it was just the first chapter? She turned to him, and there it was again, that pull. That quiet, steady thing between them that asked for nothing and offered everything. Claire reached for his hand. He didn't flinch. His fingers curled around hers like they'd always known the shape. Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside, something new was beginning, slow and sure. And this time, neither of them would be left behind. Autumn arrived slowly, brushing the edges of their days with rust-colored light and the smell of wood smoke. The trees in the city park turned with quiet ceremony, first the golds, then the deep reds, and Claire found herself walking there more often. Sometimes with Elias, sometimes alone, but always with a growing sense that life was no longer a place she observed from a safe distance. She was in it again, feeling it, letting it touch her. Elias had started rebuilding furniture in the afternoons. Nothing grand, just small pieces at first. A narrow table, a bookshelf made of salvaged pine. He worked carefully, still nursing the remnants of muscle weakness, but with the kind of attention that made even simple things feel meaningful. One morning, he invited Claire over to see what he called his first finished thing. When she stepped into his living room, there it was, a writing desk, smooth and golden in the sunlight, not flashy, not perfect, but solid, made with care. "I thought you could use a place to write," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "You always wrote better letters than I did." Claire stepped closer, running her hand along the grain. There, tucked into the corner of the drawer, was a small inscription, burned into the wood with delicate care. "For the one who left light in the dark." She swallowed hard. "It's beautiful." He didn't say anything, just watched her like he was memorizing her response. They hadn't kissed yet. Not because there wasn't desire, there was, and they both felt it, but because their closeness had grown in the space between need and trust. Every shared silence, every story told at dusk, every look across the room had built something more enduring than impulse. But now, standing by the desk, Claire turned to him with something soft and open in her face. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Anything." "Do you ever worry that what brought us together might be the only thing holding us there?" Elias looked at her, quiet. Then he crossed the space between them slowly, deliberately, until he stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "No," he said, "because the notes were only the beginning. What's holding me now is you, all of you, even the parts I'm still getting to know." Claire breathed out, and it felt like something inside her loosened. Not a falling apart, more like a falling into place. Their first kiss was not urgent, it was slow, almost reverent, like a promise made under the breath. His hand came up to her face, thumb brushing the line of her cheek, and when their lips met, it wasn't fire, it was warmth. Steady and deep, like the kind that stays long after the flames have gone out. Later, they sat on the couch with his dog-eared copy of Lonesome Dove between them, rereading old notes. "I think I fell in love with your handwriting before I knew your face," Elias said. Claire laughed. "That's a terrible reason." "It's mine." They didn't rush anything. They moved through this new chapter with the same careful tenderness that had carried them through the first. She invited him over for dinner one night and burned the chicken, laughing so hard she cried. He brought her a mug of tea with a scribbled note tucked under the handle that said, "No one cares about the chicken. I'm just glad you're here." He met her friends. She met the man who'd been his supervisor before the accident, a gruff older carpenter named Hank who choked up when he saw Elias standing on his own 2 feet. And through it all, they kept talking. About grief, about recovery, about the way the world feels different after you've almost left it. One night they sat on her porch beneath a sky scraped with stars. The air was sharp with early frost. She wore his hoodie, sleeves too long, and he held a cup of cider between his hands. "Do you remember the dream you were having when you frowned?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, but I remember the feeling of trying to come back, like swimming toward a voice I couldn't quite hear." She looked at him, her heart full. "That was me." "I know," he said, "you were the anchor." They were not the kind of people who needed constant reassurance. Their connection wasn't showy. It lived in the way they noticed each other's tired days, the way Claire kept an extra blanket on the couch he sometimes napped on, the way Elias fixed the broken hinge on her kitchen cabinet without saying a word. It lived in gesture, in shared space, in the quiet presence of someone who had chosen to stay. And yet beneath that calm, Claire sometimes felt fear tugging at her. The fear of loss wasn't something that ever fully went away. She had seen too many sudden endings lived through her own. Love, no matter how carefully held, could vanish without warning. Ilias sensed it even before she put it into words. One evening, after a long walk, he pulled her close and held her for a long moment. "I can't promise the world won't take from us again," he said, "but I can promise I'll meet you in it every day, as long as I can." Claire pressed her forehead to his, and for the first time in years she let herself believe that this quiet, steady love could last. Not because it was immune to pain, but because it had been forged in it. Winter crept in on soft feet, blanketing the city in frost and early dusk. The hospital windows shimmered with condensation, and the scent of clove and pine began to wind through the hallways as staff hung lights above the nurses' station and taped handmade paper snowflakes to the patient doors. Claire worked the early shift now by choice. She liked the quiet before sunrise, the hush of the floor before the day began its full rhythm. She liked how Elias would sometimes meet her after work, waiting in the hospital cafe with 2 mugs and that familiar look in his eyes like he hadn't stopped thinking about her since she left. They had built something real in the months since his discharge, steady, unhurried. A rhythm of dinners and long walks, of fixing things and folding laundry, of phone calls that ended with shared silence instead of rushed goodbyes. There was no need for performance. Love had found them in its gentlest form. But it wasn't all ease. Recovery was like that, grit stitched into grace. Elias still had days when the fatigue came sharp and sudden, when his body reminded him that it had once forgotten how to function. And Claire had her shadows too. The ache of Micah still found her sometimes, not as grief anymore, but as a shape in the corner of memory. She didn't hide it. Elias didn't try to erase it. They let those parts of each other exist, side by side with all the newness they were still discovering. On Christmas Eve, snow began to fall, big, slow flakes that turned the streets to quiet poetry. Claire was just finishing her shift when she found an envelope taped to her locker. It wasn't addressed. Inside was a single note in Elias' handwriting. Room 413, one more time. Her heart gave a small, stunned jolt. She hadn't been inside that room since he left. The bed had long been reassigned, the machines cleared. It was just another quiet space now, waiting for someone else. Claire moved through the hallway like something was pulling her forward. When she opened the door, the room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a small lamp. There were no machines, no charts, just Elias standing near the window, a folded blanket in his hands and a look in his eyes that stilled her breath. He'd laid the notes out along the windowsill, every single one she had written. Neatly arranged, paper creased and faded at the edges, words still legible in her familiar hand. "I used to think this room was the loneliest place in the world," he said, "until you made it feel like home." Claire stepped inside, the door closing quietly behind her. "Why bring me back here?" Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out one more note, smaller than the rest, new paper. He handed it to her and she unfolded it slowly. "You didn't just bring me back to life, you brought me forward, into a life I didn't know I could have, one with mornings and coffee and basil on windowsills and the sound of your voice reading next to me in bed. If you'll let me, I'd like to spend the rest of that life beside you, not because I owe you, but because I love you. And I think I have for longer than I can explain." Claire looked up, eyes wide, breath caught. Elias held out his hand, not for drama, not on one knee, but steady and certain. There was no ring, just the offering of presence, of future, of all the ordinary days they could still have. "I don't need an answer now," he said. "I just needed you to know." But she was already stepping forward, tears catching in the corners of her smile. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, Elias." They stood together in the room where silence had once ruled, where machines had hummed in place of words, and where one woman's notes had lit a path back to the world. Claire rested her forehead against his, just as she had once held his hand when he couldn't speak, when he lay lost in the quiet. But this time she could hear his breath, feel the warmth of him. And behind them, the notes fluttered gently in the draft from the heater, like the room itself was breathing again. Later, as they walked out into the snowfall, Claire took his hand in hers. The city was hushed and glimmering, the streets soft underfoot. "I think," she said, "this was always going to be more than a story about waking up." Elias glanced at her, brow raised. She smiled. "It's about staying awake together." They kept walking, snow catching in their hair, the night alive around them. Not chasing anything, not escaping anything, just moving forward hand in hand into the life they had found by accident and chosen on purpose. And behind them, room 413 stood quiet again. But not empty, never empty.